Imagine making like a perfectly calculated, data-driven decision based on literally decades of historical evidence,
Right.
only for half the country to turn around and tell you that you've just been brainwashed.
Yeah, that is exactly the paradox we're looking at today. It creates this fundamental breakdown in how political factions even perceive reality, you know?
Exactly, because you look at the history, you weigh the policies, you make a totally logical choice.
Mm.
And instead of being treated as a rational political actor, you are told you've been tricked.
Which means, I mean, when one side believes they're being logical and the other side insists they're just manipulated, any meaningful dialogue just collapses. So on Friday, March 27th, 2026, millions of people tuned into this podcast interview. It was entertainer Nick Cannon speaking with Amber Rose.
Democrats don't care about black people, and they don't care about people. They don't care about people of color, and the Republicans do, and that's the misconception.
And you know what? I agree with you 100%.
Thank you,
People
Nick.
don't know that the Democrats is the party of the KKK.
Yep,
People don't know that the Republicans are the party that freed the slaves.
yep.
And we're treating this as your personal talking points clinic. The mission here is to arm you with the actual factual timeline of American political history, you know, to really understand where these claims come from, and more importantly, how this kind of loose history is actively weaponized today. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to tackle Cannon's first claim head on. This whole idea that the Democratic Party founded the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, looking at the AP News historical fact check in our stack, we can just put this one to bed immediately. It's a falsehood, full stop.
Right. The KKK was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in the late 1860s, and it was started by 6 Confederate veterans, guys like Frank McCord, Richard Reed, John Lester.
And if you look at the historical record, they didn't found it as some sort of political action committee. It wasn't an arm of the Democratic National Committee.
No, not at all.
Mark Pitkovich, he's a senior fellow at the Anti-Defamation League. He notes in our sources that the group was originally designed purely for entertainment. It was just a social club with absolutely no political motivations at its inception.
Wow, just a social club.
Yeah, these veterans engaged in social antics that eventually escalated. They turned into cruel pranks, and then, by 1867, horrific violent acts and domestic terrorism. But the Democratic Party, as an institution, had literally nothing to do with its creation.
If the Democratic Party didn't found the Klan, why does that myth persist? And why were so many early Klan members Democrats?
Well, that comes down to a massive political power vacuum. By the mid-19th century, the Whig Party had completely collapsed.
Mostly over the issue of slavery expanding, right?
Yes, exactly. So this left a massive void in the South. And following the Civil War, white Southerners absolutely loathed the Republican Party.
Because that was the party of Lincoln, the Union Army, Reconstruction.
Right. So because the Whig Party was dead, the only viable opposition party available to local racists in the South was the Democratic Party. So, you know, they naturally gravitated there.
So the strategy of blaming the Democratic Party for the KKK's creation today, it isn't just a simple misunderstanding of history. It's a deliberate, ham-handed talking point.
Oh, absolutely.
The goal is to peel off black votes,
Right.
Or just generate enough cynicism to depress modern minority voter turnout entirely. It basically relies on the listener having zero understanding of how political platforms evolved over the last century and a half.
Which perfectly explains the utility of Cannon's second point. The quote, Republicans freed the slaves.
Right, the Lincoln defense.
Yeah. It is this massive oversimplification designed to sanitize history. I mean, yes, Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and he did issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
But when you actually read the historical transcripts from that era, Lincoln's personal and political reality was infinitely more complex than a modern soundbite.
Oh, it's genuinely jarring when you read his actual words.
Let's start right at the top with Abraham Lincoln. The popular, almost mythological narrative paints him as this island of pure modern reason.
Right, like he possessed this cosmopolitan view of racial equality that somehow completely transcended the 1800s.
Exactly. But when you look at the 1858 reality, it is starkly different. So how did the man who literally freed the enslaved population actually view racial equality?
What's fascinating here is that to truly understand Lincoln's politics, you have to completely separate his moral opposition to slavery from his views on racial equality.
Which is really hard for us to do today.
It is. To a modern ear, those sound like the exact same thing, but in the 1850s, they absolutely were not.
Okay, so give us an example.
Well, if we look at the 1858 Charleston debates against Stephen Douglas, this is when Lincoln was trying to win a Senate seat in Illinois. Lincoln explicitly and vigorously defended himself against accusations that he supported equality. His exact words on that debate stage were that he was not, nor ever had been, in favor of bringing about the social and political equality of the white and black races.
Wow. That is jarring to hear.
It is. He stated clearly that he opposed making black people voters or jurors. He opposed qualifying them to hold office. And he explicitly stated his belief that there was a physical difference between the races that, in his view, assigned the superior position to the white race. You really have to remember the concept of free labor.
Free labor, right.
Historians point out that Lincoln and the early Republican base despised slavery as an economic institution because it fundamentally, structurally discriminated against poor white men who couldn't afford to own slaves.
Because they couldn't compete.
Exactly. If you were a poor white farmer or laborer, you literally could not compete in the marketplace against an elite plantation class that utilized unpaid, enslaved labor. It drove down wages and hoarded land.
So his anti-slavery stance was very much an economic defense of the white working class.
It was. But regarding emancipation itself, his stance was ultimately driven by a union-first pragmatism.
Meaning keeping the country together was the only thing that mattered.
Exactly. He famously wrote to the editor Horace Greeley that his paramount object in the struggle was to save the Union. He wrote that if he could save it without freeing a single slave, he would do it.
And if he could save it by freeing all of them, he'd do that too.
Precisely. The concept of a biracial democracy was almost unimaginable to him for most of his life.
Even during the Civil War.
In the summer of 1862, as he was literally drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln invited a delegation of 5 black leaders to the White House.
And what did he tell them?
He essentially proposed to them that freed slaves should leave the United States entirely. He offered them federal funding to go found a black republic in Panama.
Panama. That is just incredible.
Yeah, and prior to that, he had advocated for shipping freed slaves to Liberia or Haiti. He truly believed that the racial divide was so deep that the two populations could never peacefully coexist on the same soil.
But to be fair to the historical record, his views weren't permanently frozen, right?
That's a crucial point. They did evolve toward the very end.
And what caused that shift?
It was primarily due to his exposure to the sheer bravery and sacrifice of black Union soldiers during the war. That really shifted his perspective.
So we see a change in his rhetoric later on.
Yes. In his final public speech on April 11th, 1865, from the White House balcony, Lincoln tentatively suggested, for the first time, limited voting rights for very intelligent, educated black men and black military veterans.
Which for 1865 was a massive, unprecedented step forward for a sitting president. And the historical ripple effect of that specific speech is staggering. Because standing in the crowd that night was John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah. Upon hearing Lincoln publicly contemplate black citizenship and voting rights, Booth turned to a companion and basically declared that this meant black citizenship and that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever make.
And 3 days later, Booth assassinated the president. Lincoln evolved, and he was murdered specifically for that evolution.
So, following the Civil War, the Republican Party was the party of Reconstruction. They had a stronghold in the North.
But obviously, American political history isn't a straight, clean timeline. It's more like tectonic plates that occasionally just violently swap places.
That's a great way to put it.
Because today, the South is a Republican stronghold, and the North leans heavily Democratic.
Yep.
So how did the actual mechanics of that flip happen?
Well, historians refer to this as the Great Realignment. Smithsonian curator John Greenspan outlines that the shift didn't happen overnight. It actually began in the 1930s.
With Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, right?
Yes. The massive economic relief programs provided by the Democratic administration slowly started drawing black voters into the Democratic coalition for the first time.
But the real earthquake, that moment the tectonic plates violently shifted, was 1964. Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law, federally ending segregation and Jim Crow.
And by taking that national stance, Johnson instantly alienated a massive block of white Southern voters.
And at that exact moment, the Republican Party saw a strategic opening. The Republican presidential nominee that year, Senator Barry Goldwater, ran heavily on his states' rights platform.
Right, and he had personally voted against the Civil Rights Act. And while Goldwater argued his opposition was based on, constitutional limits of federal power rather than racial animus.
White Southerners heard states' rights and correctly interpreted it as a defense of segregation.
Exactly. The way Southern Democrats behaved historically, enforcing Jim Crow, suppressing rights, was fundamentally because they were Southern. not because they were Democrats.
Right. While the North absolutely harbored racist views, the overt, violently enforced racism was regional, and it was explicitly enshrined in Southern state laws. The South was serious about it. They still are to this day.
So when the National Democratic Party finally embraced civil rights, the conservative white South abandoned them and moved to the GOP, which offered them a welcoming home under that banner of states' rights.
Prominent Southern Democrats, like Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, suddenly switched their affiliation and became Republicans.
And the demographic impact was immediate. In that 1964 election, 94% of black voters chose the Democrat, Johnson, over the Republican, Goldwater.
I want to push back on a specific myth here, though, because looking at the party politics study in our stack, this wasn't just a simple case of every racist local politician crossing out the D next to their name and writing in an R.
No, it was much more systemic than that.
Right. The actual demographic shift of who was running the South was mechanically tied to something completely unexpected: residential air conditioning.
Yes. That is one of the most fascinating mechanisms in this entire history. Between 1952 and 1980, the new Southern Republicans taking office were, on paper, incredibly different from the old guard local Southern Democrats.
Because the invention of air conditioning made the South hospitable to Northern transplants year-round.
Exactly. Suddenly you had a massive influx of Northern business professionals and corporate executives moving down South for industry and retirement, and they brought their Northern pro-business, anti-union Republican voting habits with them.
So initially, these new Southern Republicans weren't the old Jim Crow architects. On the economy, they voted exactly like Northern Republicans.
But, and this is a massive event, Republican state leaders quickly realized a mathematical reality.
Simply being the party of Northern business interests wasn't enough to win majorities in the South. To capture the state houses, they had to systematically rebrand as a white party.
To achieve this, they formed what political scientists call the sectional conservative coalition. This was a process of legislative log rolling, essentially trading votes.
So Southern Republicans would vote with Northern Republicans to pass pro-business, deregulatory economic policy.
Yes, and in exchange, when it came to civil rights, they formed a unified voting bloc to stall or reverse racial progress, voting exactly like the old segregationist Southern Democrats. Black voters do not support the Republican Party, and crucially, this isn't because they're bamboozled or blindly loyal.
Right. This voting behavior is actually a highly rational, calculated response.
Yeah, a response to the GOP's own rhetoric, its historical policy shifts, and its modern-day associations. And that strategy of leveraging white racial grievance only accelerated over the following decades. By the 1994 Republican Revolution, the GOP was explicitly leaning into this demographic.
Right. Former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich openly acknowledged this strategy. He even referred to himself as an angry white male in a Time magazine interview that year.
Yeah, the party recognized that stoking that specific demographic anger was a highly effective mechanism for driving voter turnout.
But courting that demographic brought an immense amount of white nationalist and alt-right baggage into the mainstream GOP. Baggage that low-information talking points completely ignore.
Yeah, let's look at the Guardian report in our stack regarding senior Republican leadership.
In 2014, it was revealed that Steve Scalise, who was the House Majority Whip, literally the third highest-ranking Republican in the chamber, had been an honored guest speaker at a 2002 conference hosted by the European American Unity and Rights Organization, or URO.
And for listeners who might not be familiar with URO, it was an organization founded by David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. It was explicitly a white supremacist group.
The defining takeaway here isn't just that he attended. It's that an ambitious conservative politician in Louisiana in 2002 assessed the political landscape and determined that speaking to a fringe, far-right group associated with the former head of the KKK was just, well, a normal, acceptable stop on the campaign trail to secure votes.
This is a consistent pattern extending right into the present day. We see the influence of neo-Nazis like Nick Fuentes dining with party leaders and an increasing tolerance for white nationalist rhetoric at the congressional and cabinet levels.
We've got leaked chats from young Republican chapters showcasing explicit racism. We're seeing a coordinated legislative push that is staunchly anti-DEI.
Yeah, and we're seeing efforts to replace highly qualified black generals with lesser qualified white officers. Plus, systematic campaigns at the state level to literally erase black history from textbooks, museums, or just erase black servicemen from websites entirely.
The rhetoric has devolved to the point where a common mantra emerging in certain circles portrays slavery as a job opportunity, where enslaved Black people could learn a trade.
Yeah.
You actually hear the question posed, where would Blacks be without slavery?
The historical consensus in our stack points to a stark reality. If a minority group overwhelmingly advocates for a policy, the modern Republican Party apparatus often reflexively positions itself in open opposition.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, right now in 2026? How does this history of the Southern strategy, the log rolling of the sectional conservative coalition, and the white party rebranding manifest in the actual mechanics of our elections today?
Because the fundamental underlying tactical goal hasn't changed in 50 years. If you cannot win the majority of all voters based on your policy platform, you have to control the machinery of who actually gets to cast a ballot.
As part of this clinic, we need to contrast the two parties honestly regarding their mechanical approach to the voting booth today.
Looking at the stated platforms and legislative actions documented in our sources, the 2026 Democratic Party operates on a philosophy of maximum enfranchisement.
Their operating principle is that every single eligible voter should have easy access to the ballot. They design legislation with the acceptance that very rarely an ineligible person might slip through, because their ultimate priority is ensuring no legitimate citizen is ever disenfranchised.
But the legislative strategy of the GOP, as analyzed in the Brennan Center reports and academic studies in our stack, operates on the exact opposite priority.
The party is currently obsessed with what data consistently shows is a statistically non-existent threat: the mythical unicorn illegal alien voter, or the phantom dead voter.
Study after rigorous study confirms that widespread in-person voter fraud simply does not exist in any statistically significant way.
Yet the GOP uses this mythical boogeyman to justify incredibly aggressive legislation designed to throw millions of fully eligible voters off the registration rolls.
They have intentionally made the bureaucratic act of registering voters so legally perilous, threatening volunteers with severe fines and criminal charges for minor clerical errors.
It's gotten so bad that venerable organizations like the League of Women Voters have actually been forced to halt their voter registration operations in several states.
And the most prominent modern weapon in this strategy is a piece of federal legislation currently dominating the headlines, the SAVE Act.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of the SAVE Act. When you look past the sanitized language of election integrity, how does this legislation structurally create a voter purge?
The mechanism is both incredibly simple and devastatingly effective. The SAVE Act is designed to allow the federal government to essentially mandate extreme, often difficult to produce, documentary proof of citizenship for federal elections.
We're talking about requiring specific types of original birth certificates or naturalization papers just to stay on the voter roll, right? Even for citizens who have been voting legally and consistently for decades.
Exactly. It creates an immediate administrative choke point.
How so?
Well, if a married woman's current ID doesn't perfectly match her maiden name on a decades-old birth certificate, or if a minority voter born in a rural area doesn't have immediate access to a physical hospital record, their right to vote is suspended.
So it provides a legal mechanism for the government to silently and cleanly purge massive demographic groups that historically vote against them. In fact, Republican leadership has threatened to shut down the entire national government over forcing the SAVE Act into law.
The poll taxes and literacy tests of the Jim Crow South were explicitly racist by design. They forced voters to guess how many jelly beans were in a jar just to cast a ballot.
Modern voter suppression uses the sterile administrative language of bureaucracy instead.
But the suppression is laser targeted. Minorities, particularly Black voters, overwhelmingly happen to vote Democratic. The modern GOP loves Black voters, provided they vote Republican.
But because that demographic leans heavily Democratic, the party apparatus utilizes tools like the SAVE Act to surgically shrink their voice. We have to look at how individual grievances are manufactured into these broader political narratives.
Right. This recurring theme of the unqualified minority.
Yeah. And the primary example they use to illustrate this is the political commentator Charlie Kirk.
Right. Kirk basically described Martin Luther King Jr. as not a good person and heavily criticized the Civil Rights Act.
He claimed it created a permanent soft quota system, I think was the phrase.
Yeah, a soft quota system. And let's define what that actually means in the context of this specific political rhetoric.
This phrase is used to imply that institutions are actively bypassing merit.
Like lowering their standards just to hit a demographic target.
Exactly. It's a very deliberate mechanical framing. Yeah, it was his assertion that a less qualified Black woman took his spot at a prestigious military academy. So what's fascinating here is that for Kirk's origin story to hold any political weight, the Black person in the narrative must consistently be presented as the less qualified candidate.
Right. It's not just like a background detail.
No, it is the foundational requirement for the grievance to even function. It intrinsically equates being Black with being less qualified.
Following Kirk's death last year in 2025, recent state-level legislation, specifically that True Patriotism and Universal Student Access Act.
Literally the TPUSA Act.
Yeah, the TPUSA Act that just passed in Georgia, which actively integrates his organization's framework into public education systems.
So you have to ask, what does this all mean for the party's relationship with Black voters if this is the exact rhetoric being elevated?
Right. Like, how does a personal grievance translate into an institutional barrier?
When you elevate a foundational myth that relies on the premise that minority advancement equals lowered standards, you fundamentally alienate those voters.
Because it portrays them not as equal participants who earned their status, but as usurpers.
Exactly. And if a political party integrates the organizations and figures who champion that narrative into actual state law, it is entirely logical for the targeted demographic to reject that party.
I mean, yeah, you wouldn't vote for an entity that legally institutionalizes the idea that your success is illegitimate.
Right, that would be totally irrational.
That makes sense of the rhetoric, but a rhetorical grievance on a podcast or, in the media isn't really enough to change society on its own.
No, it requires a legal apparatus to legitimize it.
This exact narrative was formalized into a decades-long legal strategy.
And this is where we are introduced to the Abigail Fisher case.
Yeah.
Abigail Fisher, she was a white woman from Texas who sued the University of Texas over her rejected application.
And her reasoning perfectly mirrored that grievance we just discussed. She believed less qualified Black students had taken her spot.
Right. It was part of a long-term strategy.
The George W. Bush administration had previously filed an amicus brief citing against race-conscious admissions in the University of Michigan cases.
Let's actually clarify that mechanism for a second. An amicus brief is essentially a friend of the court filing, right?
Yeah, exactly. The Bush administration wasn't directly suing the University of Michigan themselves, but they used their federal weight to file the document.
Telling the Supreme Court, hey, we agree with the plaintiffs, and here is our legal argument for why you should strike this down.
It laid the ideological groundwork. It signaled the formal alignment of the executive branch with the narrative that race-conscious admissions are inherently discriminatory against the majority.
During the discovery phase of the trial, it was revealed that Abigail Fisher's scores were actually lower than many of the minority students she claimed displaced her.
And not just that. Her scores were lower than 168 white students who were admitted to the university that exact same year.
Wow.
Yeah. The factual premise of her personal grievance just completely collapsed under scrutiny.
Right. It totally fell apart.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Fisher lost her case in a 4-3 Supreme Court decision in 2016. She lost the legal battle, and the facts proved her specific grievance was unfounded.
Right.
Yet the movement she represented, groups like the Project on Fair Representation, ultimately won the war.
The narrative of displacement by diversity hires is such a potent organizing tool that it transcended the flawed facts of her individual application.
So the outrage generated by her story, even if it was factually flawed, basically built the war chest.
The momentum generated by her litigation normalized the legal arguments themselves.
Right.
It fueled the fundraising and stoked all this public outrage, which then allowed these legal groups to file subsequent better positioned lawsuits.
And that strategy is what ultimately culminated in the 2023 Supreme Court ruling that ended affirmative action in college admissions entirely.
Yep. The unqualified minority narrative doesn't actually need to be factually accurate in every instance.
It just needs to be legally weaponized often enough to permanently alter the landscape.
Exactly. To understand why these modern narratives land with such devastating alienation, we have to examine the historical bedrock of the tension.
Right.
The passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as the definitive historical turning point. Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans generally formed a coalition to support civil rights legislation.
And the resistance was concentrated almost entirely in the South.
Because while Southern Democrats were the ones standing at the podium executing the filibuster, Southern Republicans provided virtually no support to break it.
Or to pass the civil rights bills at all. They were essentially complicit through their inaction or direct opposition.
The precise moment the Republican Party began to lose the Black vote en masse.
Today, the GOP often appears to blame Black voters for shifting their allegiance.
The specific, recurring conservative talking point that accuses Black voters of being misled were living on a Democratic plantation.
Yeah, that plantation rhetoric is incredibly jarring to read.
The plantation rhetoric deliberately strips Black voters of their political agency.
Because it treats their voting behavior as just an emotional reflex rather than a calculated evaluation of policy.
Exactly.
I mean, when a political faction actively opposes the Civil Rights Act, the literal legislation securing your basic equality voting against that faction is not the result of being brainwashed.
No, the purest form of rational self-interest.
The modern GOP is asking, why did you abandon us? While entirely ignoring the historical reality of their own voting records in the 60s.
Right, it's like breaking a contract and then calling the other party irrational for walking away from the table.
That historical estrangement is the core thesis here. This estrangement isn't just trapped in the history books of the 1960s.
No, it is actively maintained and validated by how the party operates today.
The GOP's current-day associations prove to Black voters that their historical distrust is still entirely warranted.
When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. If Black voters mobilize for a modern protection or civil rights initiative, the GOP apparatus consistently mobilizes against it.
Which inherently creates the image of a party hostile to that constituency's advancement. Prominent Republican figures repeatedly and publicly associate with neo-Nazis and white nationalists.
Citing Donald Trump's famous dinner with Nick Fuentes as a known neo-Nazi.
It also brings us right up to current events, pointing to the resignation of Joe Kent just last month, in March 2026.
Right. Kent resigned as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center.
Officially over disagreements regarding the Iran war, right?
Yes, but his long-standing, heavily criticized ties to white nationalist groups.
I want to push back here for a second, or at least, play devil's advocate.
Sure.
Is one official's resignation over a foreign policy dispute in 2026, or like a single controversial dinner, really concrete proof of a systemic party issue?
We're not talking about fringe local politicians operating in the shadows here.
Right.
We're talking about associations reaching the presidential dining room and the highest domestic security administration roles in the country.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
These optics serve a very specific political utility. They signal alignment to a particular extreme segment of the base.
But the unavoidable byproduct of signaling to white nationalists is the absolute alienation of Black voters.
Exactly. It's an evaluation of evidence. Think about how optics and associations shape your own professional or personal decisions.
If you are a voter looking at a party and you see them elevating the unqualified narrative, ignoring their historical opposition to civil rights, and appointing people with white nationalist ties to counterterrorism roles, you do the math.
This is why Black voters vote the way they vote.
It isn't a trick. It is a strictly rational response to the image and the policy positions the GOP intentionally projects.
If you broadcast a narrative that a demographic success is unearned,
right,
and if your historical legacy includes stalling their foundational rights, and if your modern leadership flirts with white nationalist optics, the rational calculation for that demographic is to assume you are not acting in their best interest.
You cannot outmarket your own core associations. Black voter alignment is a logical, calculated rejection of the Republican Party.
Right.
Personal grievances of figures like Charlie Kirk are institutionalized.
And how flawed legal challenges like Abigail Fisher's act as loss leaders to basically dismantle affirmative action.
The failure to support the Civil Rights Act permanently severed the relationship.
And finally, modern extremist associations, reaching as high as presidential dinners and counterterrorism directors in 2026, provide constant present-day validation for that historical distrust. This raises an important question for anyone studying political science or organizational behavior. How can any political entity build a diverse coalition if its structural actions continually contradict its outreach messaging?
Right. Political alignment is ultimately driven by perceived threat, not just campaign promises.
It's the ultimate reality check for political strategy.
Yeah.
You can't call someone irrational for believing exactly what you show them.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over.
Oh, this should be good.
Well, it builds on this core concept of the rational voter. If voter alignment is indeed a purely rational response to a party's projected image, what would happen if the GOP woke up tomorrow and intentionally, entirely dismantled the narratives championed by figures like Charlie Kirk?
Totally drop them.
Yeah. What if they completely severed all ties with the extremist associations mentioned in the text? Would the rational response dictate an immediate dramatic shift in the Black vote back toward Republicans? Or does historical trauma and literally decades of alienated rhetoric create a generational lag that pure, cold political rationality simply cannot easily overcome?
That is a fascinating question about the limits of pure political logic.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you some new perspectives to consider. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and keep examining the mechanics of the world around you. We'll see you next time.